Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and I just watched episode 4 of season 2 and it's probably the worst episode of the entire show so far for multiple reasons. First of all, it was just kind of boring. Secondly, it had a lot of stupid stuff which I will cover in detail. And even though they did kind of pay attention to some of the details from the original Star Trek episode, the cage, which had a scene taking place on Rigel VII, as a place where a few crew members were killed and Spock was injured, which is why he was limping in the original Star Trek pilot. And we had a scene of Pike remembering something from that planet, and so in this episode they kind of tie back to that. And also it's a continuity problem with all the other Star Trek shows because the Rigel star system was actually mentioned numerous times in all the other Star Trek shows. They didn't specifically say Rigel 7, but they did talk about Rigelian planets with different numbers. And so Geordi said that he lived on Rigel 3 in the last episode of TNG, and in the first episode of Enterprise they visited Rigel 10, which apparently had numerous different alien species on it, and so it seemed as if it's a very crowded star system, that every single planet in the Rigel system is apparently an M-class planet, and some of them seem to be part of the Federation and some of them don't, and so none of this was ever addressed or mentioned in this episode, in which they apparently visited the same star system and yet only ever talked about Rigel 7, the same one from the cage, and not a single mention of any other inhabited planet in the vicinity. So that's kind of a continuity issue with all the other Star Trek shows. I'll probably do a compilation of all the times that some Rigelian planet was mentioned in all the other Star Trek shows, and then you'll see how ridiculous it is that in this episode they never once mentioned any of the other ones. Wouldn't they ask for help or ask some questions of the nearby planets if they're so close by? Wouldn't they know some more information about this planet in their own star system? And yet no such attempt was made. So it's as if the whole star system only had this one planet with life on it. Also, when we saw a Rigelian in the original episode The Cage, he looked really big and he had rotting teeth and he looked really scary and was making like animal sounds. And when we see Rigelians in this episode, they don't look like that. They look like normal humans, just from the Bronze Age. And also, apparently Pike forgot a whole box full of weapons, apparently dozens of phaser rifles, and never bothered to come back and recover them. Like, he didn't notice, like, a whole bunch of phaser rifles are missing, and somehow all those rifles are still working 5 years later. They mentioned that it's been 5 years since, and all these guards are walking around with these weapons, and the weapons still can fire, and they work normally, and so don't phaser rifles need to be recharged somehow? Even in the time of Deep Space Nine, when they were stuck on some planet fighting Jem'Hadar, they had to get some batteries for their phaser rifles to keep fighting. And so how come on this planet, 5 years after those weapons were abandoned, they're still all working perfectly? So that seems also unbelievable. And the only reason they come back to this planet now is because they noticed from space that the palace on that planet built the Starfleet symbol in their garden or something, and that's why they now have to come back to figure out what was the cultural contamination. And this whole mission doesn't really make sense. Like, they sent 3 people down to the planet on a shuttle with no equipment, no technology whatsoever. Like, isn't that a little bit too late now to fix whatever caused the contamination? Like, if this symbol became famous on the planet, what can you possibly do about it now? So what's even the point to go down there when you cannot properly scan it, you cannot properly figure out the dangers? It seems really risky to go there with no backup, no ability to defend yourself, and so this whole mission seemed really stupid and irresponsible. And Ortega really wanted to go on this away mission. She dressed up for it, and then she's told that she has to stay on the ship because there are some dangerous asteroids around and no one except her can possibly pilot the ship, and that's why she cannot come down to the planet, and she's really disappointed. And the scanners and transporters cannot pass through the atmosphere. That's why they have to use a shuttle to land, and they land like 20 kilometers away from that building and have to walk all the way there. And then Laan Noonien Singh is the first one to get symptoms of something affecting her brain. Isn't she supposed to be like the toughest one of the crew since she has some Khan genes in her? And yet she's the first one to get affected, and apparently there's some radiation on the planet which is erasing everyone's memories, and so they gradually have these symptoms, and the episode keeps trying to make us feel what the characters feel, and so they have this constant ringing in their ears and they make us hear that too, and it's like the most annoying sound in the galaxy, and we have to hear it again and again and again in this whole episode, which was really annoying. And so as they get to the castle, they're immediately captured by a bunch of soldiers. And so what a pathetic away mission. Like, they took no precautions. They brought only ancient equipment with them to fit in, and yet didn't even use that to avoid being detected. So what was their plan exactly? To break into the castle and do what? And it doesn't even matter since they get captured immediately. So wouldn't it be more clever to see them actually break in and then get captured inside? But no, they get captured before even getting close to it. And so what a pathetic away mission with no backup, no ability to call for help. And then they're brought to the king, and the king is revealed to be one of those crew members that Pike thought were killed on the planet. And so apparently he never even made sure that his people were really killed. Like, one of them was left behind, and he just assumed that he died and never came back to check. And so this guy is rightly really angry at him, and he became the king of the planet. And this is something that we often saw in TOS, that they come down to some primitive planet to discover that some former Starfleet captain made himself the ruler of that planet. I don't mind that specific idea, but they didn't really do that much with it here. So except for this revelation, we didn't really learn anything about this guy. We don't really see any evidence of him being evil. So okay, he's the ruler, he's the dictator, but maybe this planet needed that because of their unique circumstances, and I'll get to that later, but maybe that was actually somehow beneficial to the planet. I never see anything about any of that. We don't have any discussion of him bringing some new unique idea to the planet, trying to do what he thinks is right and having some kind of argument about some topic with different points of view. We don't get any of that. He's just the king, and it's bad because being king is bad, and that's it. We don't really have any ethical dilemma of any kind. And so that was also a missed opportunity. They didn't really do anything with this whole setup. And meanwhile, the Enterprise is also starting to get affected by the same radiation, and people start forgetting things. First it's Uhura, and then the rest of the crew. And then Spock makes the stupidest decision ever, and that really annoyed me. That's the most annoying thing in this whole episode. That they basically turned Spock into the opposite of what he used to be in TOS. In TOS, he was a scientist, he was a clever person, he would never do something because of some gut feeling. He would always do things scientifically, with logic, with facts, and they do the absolute opposite in this episode. So he just randomly decides that the radiation that is affecting their brains is coming from the planet, and so they could have just moved away from the planet to figure out what's going on, maybe send some shuttles, some probes to try to determine where exactly this radiation is coming from, but instead he just decides, you know what, there is some strange asteroid field near the planet. Maybe those materials in those asteroids will protect us from the radiation, which I just am guessing is coming from the planet, and so let's take the ship into that asteroid field, and then later on it turns out that those asteroids are the source of this radiation which is causing it. So he did the absolute worst possible decision. He randomly decided to pilot the ship into the middle of those asteroids, which are also a physical danger to the ship. So why not just move the ship farther away from this planet? Why not ask the nearby Rigelian planets if they know anything about it? So this show forgot all about that. That there are numerous other inhabited Rigel planets in the Rigel system. No mention of that whatsoever. And meanwhile, on the planet, Pike and his team completely lost their memories. They don't remember anything, and they're now basically slaves on the outside of that castle. Apparently, the castle itself is built of materials that shield them from the radiation from that asteroid, and also those helmets of the soldiers from the castle is also shielding them. And so all the other people constantly lose their memories every day. And some of them have tattoos on their hands to help them remember things. That reminded me of that movie Memento, when that guy kept losing his memories every few minutes, and so he constantly tattooed things on his body to help him remember. So anyway, they meet this helpful old man who helps guide them because he has all these tricks to help him remember certain things. And then when the guards mistreat him, then Pike and his team take out some of those guards and escape, and then they make their way into the palace. And then Pike beats up that king guy, and that scene in which he's approaching him and he's using like the dishes to shield himself from the phasers, it kind of reminded me of that scene in Game of Thrones when Jon Snow was fighting Ramsay, shielding himself from his arrows and then approaching him and beating him up, and so it looked exactly like that. And so I think it's probably not a coincidence, because in all the new Trek shows, they constantly have all these similarities to other movies and shows. It's as if they looked at some cool scene from some other show and want to imitate it, make their own version of it, because they cannot come up with their own cool ideas and their own action scenes. And so they're constantly imitating other movies and shows. That became a pattern, which I noticed. And then Pike immediately regained his memories after a few minutes inside that castle. And so it's so easy to solve this problem apparently. In the end of the episode, Pike decided to send some shuttles to lift up that asteroid from the planet and throw it into space. Which Spock even asks, is that not a violation of the Prime Directive? And Pike says no, because that asteroid was never supposed to be on the planet, something like that. But isn't that a natural event? Now, if they had said that maybe in their previous visit to the planet they accidentally knocked that asteroid to the planet and it caused all of this and now they're simply correcting it, then I will have no problem with it. But they didn't say that, and so it seemed to be a natural event. Therefore, it is kind of a violation of the Prime Directive, at least according to what was mentioned in TNG. And it was also silly the way they threw it out into space so easily. Remember how even back in TNG, whenever they used the tractor beam to drag something, it was always like in a straight line, like it simply pulls right behind you and then you have to disengage and move the ship out of the way to send some asteroid flying somewhere. And we had that scene in Star Trek Picard when the Shrike used the tractor beam to catch one ship and throw it at another ship, and they all seemed so amazed by it, since it's the first time that we saw someone using a tractor beam to push something sideways to throw a ship at another ship, and so they were all amazed for good reason, since we never saw that ability before. So it was some kind of new technology, some better tractor beam. And yet here, a century before all of that, apparently the Enterprise had that ability as well. They can easily grab things and throw them away sideways so easily, and so that seemed to be a contradiction with that. And the stupidest part in the whole episode is Spock's decision to pilot the ship into the asteroids which were causing all the problems in the first place. It's something that is just so stupid. Why not simply move the ship away until you figure out a way to adjust your shields to block that radiation or whatever? I don't mind the idea of some unusual, strange radiation being able to pass through the ship and its shields and all of that, because if the ship is perfect, then we wouldn't have any danger at all ever. And so I don't mind the idea that some strange radiation can pass through the shields. But what was the reason that they couldn't simply move away from the planet? Why was it necessary to move into the middle of the asteroid field without knowing anything about it, and then getting stuck there and being pummeled by it, and then no one can pilot the ship out because Ortega forgot she's the pilot? Now, this idea is also something that we saw before. There was the TNG episode Conundrum, in which the entire crew lost their memories, and it was part of some trick by an alien who wanted to use and exploit the Enterprise's weapons to fight an enemy of his people. And so there was some bigger interesting story, but also they used the opportunity in that episode of everyone losing their memories for some funny situations, for some humor. For example, in the beginning of that episode, they showed that Riker and Ro-Laren hate each other, and then after they lose their memories, they actually hook up with each other, and then in the end, when they regain their memories, it makes everything really awkward, and so it was a funny humor situation. So in the old shows, they always used whatever unique situation they got caught in to play with it, to do some cool things, or some funny things, or some interesting things, and yet here, things just happen, and they don't do anything with it. It's like a missed opportunity. So everyone loses their memories and then they regain them, and nothing really happened in between. And so what was the point of any of it? They all walk around the corridors looking confused. They don't know who they are and where they are. Then there's this one guy who's terrified, who sits at the corner scared and literally shaking, and he just happens to be a man. While all the women in the corridors are just kind of confused, but they are not scared. They're just walking around kind of curiously looking at things, and this one man who we see is terrified and shaking in the corner. So I suspect it's not a coincidence, because it's something that keeps happening in almost every single episode, that they have to show that women are strong and brave and smart, while most of the men we see are always either incompetent or evil or scared or cowardly or stupid and so on. And so it became like a pattern which is becoming ridiculous. I have a problem that they're doing the opposite of what used to be the problem. I do admit that in old shows and movies, there was the tendency to show that the men are the heroes, they are the strongest and bravest, and while the women need their help, they need to be rescued and all of that. And now they're doing the opposite. And even in all the scenes with Pike, who is the lead of the show, they always keep showing him in the kitchen. He's always cooking food for his woman, and then she gives him gifts. And then he's the one who has to beg for her forgiveness in the end of the episode, because he offended her in the beginning, and he has to come back crawling to her and begging for her forgiveness. and then always cooking some food for all the women on the ship. Like, isn't he the captain of the ship? Why does he constantly in the kitchen cooking food as if he's the chef of the ship? And there was even a scene in the previous season when the Spock came in and then Spock was doing the dishes. They don't even have a dishwasher, which we have today. Nowadays we have it, but on their advanced starship, they don't even have a dishwasher. They have to do it by hand. And so Pike was cooking and Spock was doing the dishes while all the women on the crew were just eating their food while the men do all the kitchen work. And so is that kind of revenge? Is that kind of agenda of showing the opposite? Like, it needs to be the opposite. A man's place is in the kitchen. Like, it's ridiculous. And also Pike's quarters, even though I do enjoy how they look, it looks really spacious. The screens on the walls that show you like a beautiful view. So I do like the design of his quarters, but it's also a continuity issue with the other Trek shows, because remember Scotty when he came on the Enterprise D and he was surprised by how big the quarters are? He said even an admiral wouldn't get such big quarters on a starship in his day, and yet Pike has a gigantic house inside the ship, and he is using candles, and he has a fireplace with real fire, and it all looks good, but it makes no sense on a starship. Even in TNG there was a scene when Worf lit some candles in his quarters, and then Picard came to him and was kind of angry about it. He said, "Why are you lighting fire inside your quarters? You should be using the holodeck instead. Why use real candles in the quarters?" And so, if it was such a big deal in the time of TNG, how come Pike has all these fireplaces and candles all over his quarters? And so, it's kind of too much. I don't mind the ship being beautiful on the inside. That's something I wanted to see. That's something I like in this show. But yet, it's still on a spaceship, right? So why is there a fireplace burning oxygen inside his quarters? What if there's an emergency and it accidentally causes a fire to catch on to the rest of his quarters or something? So it makes no sense. Like, he leaves the room and the fire is still burning, and so it's kind of too much for my taste, for my logic center. And also when we see Ortega enter her quarters, she also has a gigantic quarters all to herself apparently. And then she's able to figure out, with the computer's help I guess, that she is the pilot of the ship, and she's the only one that can get the ship out of trouble. The same trouble that Spock got them into, since the asteroids are pounding the ship from all directions. Spock is helpless, Spock is a total idiot, he cannot do anything, and then she takes the helm, and then she saves the ship by suddenly remembering that she's the best pilot in the galaxy, and she's using phasers to drill holes through asteroids and punch her way through the asteroid. And then Pike comes back, and then he meets his girlfriend again, and he begs her for forgiveness, and then it kind of zooms out of the window into space after they came back together, which reminded me of the ending of season 2 of Picard. Picard didn't want to hook up with Laris, who had the hots for him, and then in the end of the season he did come back to her and apologize to her, and then it also zoomed out of a window. And so that's another problem with all these new shows, that I keep feeling as if they're recycling the few ideas they have. I keep seeing them over and over again in different variations, but it's the same basic idea over and over again, and it feels really unoriginal and not imaginative. And that's another issue I have with all the new Trek shows. There was not really any new idea at all in this whole episode. What new idea was explored? What new science fiction idea or some ethical, moral dilemma was explored? Nothing really happened. At least when they had that guy ruling the planet, at least show why it's bad, at least show him having some strange idea of how to run a society. Something like that could have been fun, SG-1 did that a lot of times. Again, going to some strange planet, seeing some strange ruling class which is unjust in some way and yet with some interesting idea to explore, to debate about, and then ultimately making the correct decision for whatever would benefit the planet. And yet here they don't really deal with any topic whatsoever. So, oh, there's some evil radiation coming from an asteroid, let's just remove the asteroid and that's it. So that's the whole plot of the episode basically. And the crew losing their memories and then randomly walking around the corridors, and the only one who is scared is that white guy, while all the women are just confused, and then Ortega manages to overcome it and save the ship while Spock is a total idiot. And then that's it. And so what was the point of that? They didn't have fun with it. So if they had some comedy situations on the ship, like they did in TNG, when Rolaren and Riker were hating each other, then they lost their memories and then they hooked up, and then it's really awkward in the end, and so that was at least funny. And there was also a bigger story in that episode, some alien wanted to use the Enterprise as his weapon against another enemy, and there was the moral debate about they don't remember why they're part of that war, should they still continue the war or not, and then in the end Picard makes a moral decision not to fire on defenseless people, when they realize their enemies are far inferior in their weapons, and so they do not fire on that space station. That was a great moment. That is something that is teaching you something. And here it's nothing. There is no real substance to it. It's all just for the visuals, I guess. And so it kind of lacks a soul. And while I appreciate some of the attention to detail to the Rigelian stuff from the old episode, but at the same time it violates all the other mentions of all the other Rigelian planets, and I will do a long compilation of all those mentions from all the other shows, and it will be funny contrasting it with what we see in this episode, in which they are apparently unaware of all the other Rigelian planets, even though in Enterprise they visited Rigel X and it was a century before this show, so how come they don't know about it here? And we saw numerous different aliens on that planet, and yet again no other alien ships in the vicinity, no one to call for help, completely ignoring the continuity of all the other Star Trek shows. So I will be making a lot of compilations and comparison videos on my other channel, so check it out. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.